Before we dive in right into substantive topic again, thank you to all of the helping hands in the background, including Benson on my side, checking all the speakers and making this global conversation possible. So let's get started. My name is Stefan Schweinfest. I'm the director of the United Nations Statistics Division in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at UN headquarters in New York. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this first Housing Sprint webinar of the United Nations Network of Economic Statisticians. This network was founded by our United Nations Statistical Commission in 2021, and the Commission is our highest global executive body for statistics and data. I note that there have been over 250 participants who registered their interest, so they may come in at various points of this webinar, and that only shows the global interest into this topic of housing. It's critically important. I'm also very happy that we have three distinguished guests at today's webinar. So first of all, Mr. Michal Milja, UN Assistant Secretary General and Acting Executive Director of UN Habitat, our UN partners in this important topic, who will help me to provide opening remarks. And then we are particularly happy to have presentations by His Excellency Dr. Ali Haider Ahmed, Minister of Housing, Land and Urban Development from the Maldives, and Dr. Kurt Usovsky, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Affairs and the Office of Policy Development and Research of the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. So we are truly spanning the entire globe today, and it's probably the first time we have so many high-level speakers at a sprint webinar. So we are sprinting to achieve quick results. Those who have not attended our sprint webinars before, let me quickly explain that our network of economic statisticians that spans is a loose association around the world of professionals that work on economic statistics and get regularly together to discuss cutting edge and innovative themes such as this one. This working methods of sprints has been good for us because it allows you to formulate statistical responses to fast evolving and emerging socioeconomic and environmental themes. This working methods we have used in 22-23 for such topics as beyond GDP, statistical classifications, data access, and more recently, data strategy. They have typically resulted in recommendations for the follow-up by various working groups, so they have had a real impact. We, in particular, in the area of beyond GDP, we are still working on developing a framework for inclusive and sustainable well-being. I'm also confident that what we discussed today will result in recommendations that will help us globally to improve the information systems for housing. So why is housing so important? Securing housing is an essential physical, social, and psychological need for well-being. We cannot overemphasize the need for access to shelter as one of the essential needs for physiological well-being. The provision of housing involves a number of cross-cutting issues, such as social, economic, and environmental dimensions. Social issues, we are talking about affordability, accessibility, homelessness, community and social cohesion, health and safety. Economic, we have to tackle real estate market dynamics, addressing supply and demand imbalances, ensuring economic mobility through home ownership and control of rental costs, and ensuring that sufficient resources are put into the investment of real estate. Environmental, we have to tackle issues as land use, urban sprawl, energy consumption, efficiency of pollution and waste management are all important topics in the context of climate change and resilience. To address all of these needs, we need a comprehensive and integrated housing policy framework. And in order to get that, we need a comprehensive and integrated data framework with good quality and timely data on the various aspects of housing. So that's why we have the discussion today. I would like to really thank those who have made this possible today. Comprehensive planning and lots of preparatory meetings. Colleagues from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Statistics Canada, Maldives Bureau of Statistics, UN Habitat, and of course, my own colleagues in the UN Statistics Division. The team has organized numerous meetings to shape the parameters of the agenda for today's webinar. I wanted to thank the team again, and I wanted to also thank all the distinguished guests and speakers who have agreed to speak and present the various aspects of the seminar. Now, I will have the honor not only to welcome you, but I will come back and guide you through the first two sessions. So allow me to give you a very quick overview over today's agenda. After my opening remarks, we will have opening remarks by the UN Assistant Secretary General and Acting Executive Director of UN Habitat. And then we will move to the session 2, which is building the case for housing statistics. We're looking and understanding at the user needs. We statisticians are always well advised to start our work with the users and understand what they need. So we will have the presentation by His Excellency Dr. Ali Haider Ahmed, the minister from the Maldives, on the housing in the context of the Maldives. That would be followed by Dr. Usovsky's presentation from the United States, housing data for economic analysis. And then the session 2 will end with a presentation on the use of housing data in the Reserve Bank of Australia, a presentation made by Mr. Jonathan Hambur of the Reserve Bank of Australia. After each presentation, we will open the floor, so we will be able to ask questions and engage briefly in a conversation. And then we will have a session 3, where we talk about a housing framework for the future, so shifting a little bit to the production perspective of data. And there we have a presentation on a conceptual framework for housing statistics, bridging social, economic, and environmental statistics by our dear colleague, Mr. Jean-Philippe Deschamps-Laporte, Assistant Director of the Center for Income and Economic Social Well-being in Statistics Canada. So at the end, we will conclude with some reflections, and in order to help me with session 3, I have the support of Mr. Jonathan Coe of the Australian Bureau of Statistics, who has kindly agreed to conclude this meeting for us. So lots of exciting programs ahead of us. I look forward to the presentations. I look forward to your active participation. Welcome you warmly again around the globe, and then I hand now over for opening remarks by our dear colleague, Mr. Michael Mliar, UN Assistant Secretary General and Acting Executive Director of UN Habitat. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, dear Stefan, and sincere greetings to all the participants, excellencies, distinguished colleagues. First of all, big thanks for choosing the important topic of housing, which for UN Habitat indeed is super important, and it is at the core of our mandate. I'm joining you today virtually from the Swiss Alps, from the Clusters Forum. That's why you have the background, which is more typical for where I am right now. But at UN Habitat, we take care of sustainable cities, communities, and human settlements, and we do not discriminate against any type of those. On behalf of UN Habitat, indeed, it is my great pleasure to join you today for this housing sprint of the United Nations Network of Economic Statisticians. Indeed, 76 years ago, the world committed to housing as a human right through the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which, if I may remind you, states the following, and I quote, "Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services," end of quote. We are really basing our efforts on this noble and ambitious, important commitment. Building on that, for decades, UN system under the leadership of UN Habitat has promoted the adequate housing agenda. Since our establishment as UN Habitat in 1977, which was the outcome of the first United Nations Conference on Human Settlements and Sustainable Urban Development held in Vancouver, Canada in '76, housing has been a priority agenda for us. And in fact, the Vancouver Declaration of 1976 prioritized shelter as a fundamental condition for better quality of life. And that particular angle remains extremely relevant also today, maybe even more relevant than before. Quality of life and the way we focus on the housing agenda in that particular context. It noted, the Vancouver Declaration, that, and I quote again, "Shelter, infrastructure, and services are not only essential for meeting basic human needs, they are also tools for improving living conditions, achieving social justice, shaping the pattern and character of settlements, and creating employment opportunities," end of quote. Yet today we can clearly see that the world is yet to fully realize this right to housing. There is still a lot of work to be done, and in fact we see today that the need of housing being addressed, whether in the global south or in the global north, is increasingly not only relevant, but I would say even urgent. In July last year, we published a global report assessing progress with SDG 11, including the commitment to address challenges of slums and the global housing crisis. And the results were quite alarming. Just let me mention a few. 2.8 billion people affected by housing inadequacy, 1.1 billion people living in slums and informal settlements, 165 million additional slum dwellers emerged over the last 20 years, and 318 million people experiencing some sort or some type of homelessness. So, of course, the housing issue is much broader than just our efforts to build adequate houses. It's linked to many other areas of social and economic policies that need to be addressed and need to be prioritized, whether on the local, on the regional, or on the national as well as global level. What it also means is that around 96,000 new housing units would need to be built every day across the world to meet the adequate housing need by 2030. Which we, of course, know is not happening and it's not realistic, but it is, we believe, helpful to remind ourselves also through pieces of statistics like that of the gap that we are talking about and of the nature of the challenge that we are facing and that needs to be urgently addressed. Following many years of housing sector support to countries, we know that the global housing crisis is a complex and pressing issue that affects billions of people and communities worldwide. And indeed, we are not over-exaggerating when we call it a global housing crisis. The crisis is rooted in a complex interplay of factors, including rapid urbanization, population growth, economic inequalities, and gaps in public and private sector policies and investments. The consequences of this housing crisis are also significant, contributing to poverty, social unrest, and diminished quality of life. UN Habitat plays a leading role within the UN system in addressing the global housing crisis. We work with governments, communities, and other stakeholders to develop and implement innovative solutions that improve housing conditions and create sustainable urban environments. And of course, local and regional governments, led by mayors, governors, and other local actors, are absolutely essential stakeholders for us in this particular context. Throughout our work already for about 47 years, we have consistently faced a major stumbling block, and that is the lack of robust and timely data and statistics to monitor the status and challenges of housing. So this is where our efforts really need to be even better coordinated and better synchronized. While the MDGs focused on informal settlements, and there is a clear goal to address slums and housing through SDG 11 generating additional data and insights, we still face considerable challenges in monitoring progress on the wider housing sector challenges. Indeed, today SDG 11 faces the most significant gaps in measurement and monitoring among other SDGs. So once again, I really welcome today's Sprint webinar focusing on this particular issue, which is part of our efforts under SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities. While monitoring of housing conditions is ongoing in many contexts and institutions, we still lack sufficient globally harmonized and comparable methods, data that allows us to join hands in global advocacy and action to tackle the ever-growing crisis. As UN Habitat, we feel it is high time to address critical global gaps on the monitoring of adequate housing, partnering with all relevant entities and actors, and we are afraid that we can no longer wait. We must indeed join hands in this effort with many other partners. We have been prioritizing strong partnerships increasingly actively. This is why today's housing sprint with economists and statisticians provides a significant opportunity to address the gap in housing data. The sprint also fits well into the implementation plan of our UN Habitat Assembly resolution on housing. For your information, during the second session of the UN Habitat Assembly last June, 193 UN member states took a resounding decision to elevate the question of adequate housing by adopting a resolution tasking UN Habitat to scale its work in this area by supporting countries on housing policies and data. The exchange of practices and innovations on housing indicators that will happen also at this sprint are critical to build common perspectives while leveraging our respective capacities and resources for global impact. Together, we can tackle the housing data gap, which is one of the constraints in realizing adequate housing as a human right, as recognized by world leaders already 75 years ago in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At UN Habitat, we are particularly keen to collaborate with all of you on economic indicators for housing sector, given the tremendous role of the housing sector on global and national economic growth and outcomes. Fortunately, we do have innovative and new ways of advancing housing data, and we look forward to leveraging solutions that can more quickly and more efficiently respond to the gap. We also have a lot to build on at UN Habitat. We have had decades of work on housing data, including as far back as 1988, when we had a housing indicators program. UN Habitat is pleased that you all responded positively to the invitation to jointly explore possibilities to work towards scaling up the global monitoring of housing. I look forward to this discussion and working with all partners to action then at local, national, and international levels as well. Thank you, and wishing you a very productive discussion, and looking forward indeed for further fruitful cooperation. Thank you. Back to you, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Mikhail, and I hope you forgive me if I also use your first name. As UN colleagues, you emphasized our good partnership, and I really wanted to thank you for whetting our appetite by giving us this global perspective and showing us your dedication by connecting from the Swiss Alps. You're obviously very passionate about this topic, and that was a great opener, emphasizing the human rights perspective and also instilling in us a sense of urgency by talking about both the housing gap and the housing data gap. And that's exactly what we are here to address today. So let's then jump right in. Session 2, building the case for housing statistics, understanding the user needs. And I would say we are coming from the global perspective to the very, very important national perspective. What does that mean if you are responsible for a country, and in particular a developing country? And we are extraordinarily pleased to have His Excellency, the Honorable Minister of Housing, Land and Urban Development, Dr. Ali Haider from the Maldives with us, who is not only a knowledgeable speaker because he has a doctoral qualification in planning, Development Bank and the World Bank, and having been engaged as a consultant under the previous government for the Minister of by the Minister of Planning to develop a national development plan primarily focusing on spatial planning and economic growth. And now your responsibility of minister, you are, I think, really in an excellent position to talk to us about the situation of housing in the Maldives and what you need from us statisticians. So thanks again for connecting, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefan. It's a great pleasure for me to join an esteemed group of statisticians and decision makers in the world who I'm sure are very keen to hear about the Maldives, because the Maldives is a very small country right in the middle of the Indian Ocean, coupled with the developmental challenges. We are also faced with the existential challenges of global warming and climate change. We are a very low-lying country with our highest point above just 2.5 meters above sea level. And we have about 1,200 islands, out of which 186 are inhabited. And we have a huge array of problems, including housing, which is one of the most crucial needs of any person or family. And one thing that our constitution, the new constitution that was developed in 2008, enshrines housing as a basic need. And we are required to provide adequate housing to every family. And although we do not have any homelessness, we still have a lot of housing stress because of the onset of urbanization during the last 20 years or so. Lots of people from outlying islands have been migrating to the capital, Male, where which is only about, when it started, it's only about 190 hectares. But now we have, during the last 20 years, developed a new city next to Male called Hulu Male, which is around double the size of Male, which was built out of scratch, reclaimed from the sea, and which has also been developed as an island which is more resilient to climate change because it is at a higher altitude than the other islands when we reclaimed it. And it has now flourished into a new urban city which is being populated by in migration from other islands as well as the natural growth of Male. So this has become a huge challenge for us. So let me, that's the brief overview of the housing in the Maldives, but let me go into 3 different areas of housing in the Maldives that I would like to present in this webinar. The first one is our overview of housing scenario in the Maldives, which is next slide, please. Historically, the government has given out free land plots to the people to build themselves. It's a self-built mechanism where the government gives out free land, and on the island they incrementally build a house to live in. This has been going on for centuries, and that's how it has been built. Housing has been built in the Maldives. Individuals find their own finances and construct. It takes about 15, 20 years to build a house using their own savings and borrowings. Over the years, the provision of housing has become a challenge due to land scarcity and financial constraints, especially in the urban areas. And rapid economic growth has led to this paradigm shift in housing development. Public housing was introduced in the early 1990s because there was a lot of people who had migrated to Male, and which is the capital island, and people have been renting from rooms where people are living in one-room families living in one room out in a house because there's not enough housing. So public housing was started with the support of foreign aids. And it was the Chinese government which came to our aid in this public housing program, which was only about 128 housing units in total over a period of 3 to 5 years in the 1990s. Next slide, please. So with rapid development, a cultural shift of moving away from the extended family to nucleus family has started. This has led to increase in demand for housing. And in the previous years, people have lived in extended families with their extended support network, but younger families moved to urban areas like Male. Male is the only really urban area with lots of jobs and facilities and services. So this has led to nuclear families moving with their young children to Male. This has led to increase in demand for housing. So population concentration towards Male has exacerbated the housing situation, and it has also led to most of the social problems that we are facing, like overcrowding, substance abuse, gang violence, and things like that, which has happened to some extent. No, even though it's not as severe as in some other urban areas around the world. Lack of proper housing framework and standards led to poor housing conditions in the Male regions, because when the people migrated to Male, they look for housing in private accommodation, which is not exactly built up to a very high standard. And this has led to lots of people living in poor housing conditions and overcrowding as well. So the housing sector itself emerged out of market forces. Because of the demand for housing, this has led to lots of people building their land on Male to 10 to 15 stories high, because of the demand for housing from the immigrants, and also lots of foreign labor that has migrated to Male because of the expansion of the tourism industry and also the construction industry as well. So housing sector was actually driven by market forces. And in order to cater for the housing need, we had to reclaim the land that was that I had mentioned in my introduction, Hulu Male, which is next to Male, just on the other side of the airport. Next slide, please. So over the years, the construction industry has bloomed, partly because of the housing construction. The construction industry now amounts to about 6.8% of the GDP of the Maldives, according to Maldives Bureau of Statistics 2022 data. The turnover of approximately 4.8 billion rupiah, which is around how much? Say about 800 billion US dollars. Construction industry. Sorry, 800 million. Construction industry employed 3.4% of local labor, while expatriate workers employed a staggering 92% of the employment in the construction industry. Because we don't have, our labor force is not geared towards manual labor, because they get other jobs that are more lucrative or better paid. They don't engage in the construction industry, which is very much labor intensive. Next slide, please. This shows the growth of the imports, because we have to import all our building materials. Including sand, cement, and even aggregate for construction is imported from overseas. This shows how it has changed over the years from 2016 to 2021. As you can see, the growth, there was a blip in the growth rate during the COVID pandemic, but otherwise it has stayed quite stable throughout the years. Next slide, please. Okay, let's look into the legal framework. As I said, the Constitution enshrines that housing is a basic need, so it is something that the government has an obligation to provide, which of course is a very noble. And also because of it's also a universal human right. It's a very noble clause to be enshrined in the Constitution. But there has been, although as I've mentioned before, there has been no homelessness as such. There's a lot of overcrowding in the capital region. The housing in the islands are very basic, with very basic needs, although most of the housing have piped water, sewerage connections, and also electricity and even communications and everything that you need in a house. Maldives' national housing policy was developed in 2008, which sort of governs how the housing is going to be developed. It included a social housing framework where we have a bank that is set up that provides housing finance to needy households to acquire housing. The Land Act of 2002 and the Startup Property Act of 2021 are relevant regulations that also govern the multi-story housing and how land is allocated to people for housing. The Building Act of 2017 controls, of course, the health and safety regulations related to the housing and also other construction as well. And also there are environmental controls enshrined in the Environmental Act, which governs the energy, utility regulation, environmental impact assessments, and the Environmental Protection Agency ensures that these are carried out. Next slide, please. So issues facing the housing sector are, as I have mentioned, housing backlogs estimated around 25,000 in need for housing in the Malé region. But housing shortage is only one aspect of the national housing problem, which is, as I said, because of the immigration to Malé region. Also, we have other issues like allocation and affordability. What has happened in previous years is because we do not have a lot of a mix of housing that is produced over the years. Everybody is entitled and also because there's no choice, everybody applies for social housing because that's the most of the housing stock that is being produced. While we have to target the most needy to social housing and produce other mid-range and higher range housing, we have not been able to produce that to that extent that everybody is applying for social housing. So we have the housing allocation is a problem, and also there's a problem of housing affordability because we don't have a very robust savings habit, and because people are the salary scales and the housing prices are so high that people are not able to save a lot. So we don't. I mean, they are not bankable in the sense that for housing loans. And that's a big problem that we have in apart from housing shortage. Urban development and redevelopment is also one area where we have been trying to remove some of the congested areas in Malé and redevelop them. This is only just starting. Environmental impact of construction and land reclamation and buildings and energy efficiency are also issues that we are facing in the Maldives housing sector. The government initiatives are to increase housing stock and less private sector engagements in social or affordable housing. Let the private sector look after the mid-range and higher-end housing, while the government are involved in producing the social housing. And also we have legislative issues. Our legal system is not very geared towards solving cases of even transfer of housing, like selling and renting. Even the Tenancy Act is also very weak. We don't have, even landlords do not have eviction rights, and it needs to be also improved and addressed through the new legislative agenda of this government as well. Skills shortages, including management of housing, is also another bottleneck that we have. Lots of multi-story buildings have come up, and there is very little management of these housing blocks because the one thing, the legislation is weak, and the other thing is people are not used to multi-story living, and the they don't have the skills to manage multi-story housing as well. And also no timely and up-to-date statistics available to understand the extent of housing situation in the country. Perhaps this is the most important component for this webinar in terms of statistics not being available in the supply side and also the demand side of housing. Next slide, please. So the need for policy. The urban population is increasing in the capital city. About 2/3 of the population of the Maldives reside in the Malay region. So we need a balanced regional development. So this government has started addressing this by declaring that we will have regional development, urban development in other regions as well. Because we have about 186 islands with people, and some of the islands are very small in terms of population and also in terms of size. Generally, the islands are about, most of the islands are below 100 hectares in size. And the population of 55 islands are under 500 each, which means it's very, very difficult to provide all the services and facilities in these islands. And the regional development of this government is towards consolidating the population in urban centers where they'll get the urban services as well. And this regional planning approach is probably going to change the landscape of the country and also provide more resilient and also more balanced services to the public as well. In terms of ecological resilience as well, because smaller islands are more susceptible to climate change effects such as inundation and also coastal erosion and flooding as well. So these new integrated urban centers and sustainable development will be adopted in also national development plans. So the role of housing is going to be to increase by allowing local businesses to be involved, legal frameworks to be established, and sustainability concerns in infrastructure and through community engagements. We're going to make the new settlements, urban settlements, to be more conducive to the local population. So for all that, we need evidence-based decision making. We have a lot of statistics collected through. In 2022, we finished a national census, and also we have other statistical activities like next year we are going to have a housing income and expenditure survey, which will also provide us some indication of how much people are spending on housing and how much they can afford, which can be a great aid for us to decide on who needs housing and who needs help, and also who can afford mid-range to higher-end housing as well. So these are some of the evidence that we need in order to make sure that our housing is appropriate and suitable for the population in the Maldives. Next slide, please. That's the end. Oh, thank you very much.
Well,
So
okay. Thank you very much. I would say for taking us on a journey to the Indian Ocean and making a compelling case for housing, both housing policy and housing data and integrated frameworks. It's impressive to see how this is anchored in your constitution and is clearly identified as a basic need. You used an interesting word. I noted housing stress. And one number is definitely stuck in my mind. I'm a numbers person. 2.5 meters above sea level is not a lot. So you have also compelling images there in your presentation of reclaiming land. And I also noticed that whilst the geographical situation can be very, very different, obviously between the Maldives and the next speakers of the United States is a very different geographical situation. But there can be social shifts that have policy implications, like the tendency to nucleus families, that are exactly the same. Doesn't matter. Yeah. It could be in the Maldives or in the United States. So we are all in this together. So I understand that there are a lot of demands on your time, and you will not be able to be with us until the end of the seminar. But I just want to briefly open the floor if somebody has a question on a clarification or anything. If there is no urgent question, and I can encourage participants perhaps also to use the chat as we go through the sprint webinar. I wanted to thank you once again for your participation and again whetting our appetite. And then we can move on in the presentations to our second presentation, which is by Dr. Kurt Ossowski, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Economic Affairs in the Office for Policy Development and Research of the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. So we will hear, Dr. Ossowski has, of course, a broad housing and urban economic research program under his responsibility in the place where he is working in HUDS. I understand that's your abbreviation. And of course, I guess you are an avid user of housing market data and housing data in general. So we will be very interested hearing your perspective, in particular, as you have spent your entire career, I understand, in the U.S. Public Service in the Office of Economic Affairs, having positions of increasing responsibility for research and policy analysis, having started all the way back. I hope you don't mind if I reveal that. It dates us a little bit. We have almost the same professional starting date in 1991. Becoming now a senior economist and then the director of the division where you are. And you have also served as Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary of Economic Affairs from 2002 to 2007. So with this distinguished background and career, you are certainly in a good position to talk to us and present a case of comprehensive housing market analysis. Dr. Ossowski, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, distinguished panel, for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this talk. So we're moving here from a very small developing country to a very large developed country. But we do, as the chair mentioned, we do have some common housing challenges. I'm going to talk about how we think about housing markets in the United States. A well-known saying about real estate in the United States is all real estate issues are local, location, location, location. One of the products of my office is the comprehensive housing market analysis of markets in the United States. So I'll give a brief overview of my presentation. I went to, sorry, wrong thing. There we go. I want to talk about the purpose and use of a comprehensive housing market analysis, look at its structure, talk about the data sources. We look at the local economy and what are the drivers of the local economy. We look at the population, trends in population and households. Of course, these are the folks that need to be housed. We look at the separately owner-occupied and housing demand and supply, the owner-occupied side of the market and the renter-occupied side of the market. And then at the end, I will talk about some of the other HUD-sponsored national housing surveys that are not part of necessarily part of a comprehensive housing market analysis, but provide us with other important information about the state of housing markets and the state of housing in the United States. So a comprehensive housing market analysis is produced. We try to produce estimates for the demand for housing, and the demand for housing. This demand estimate is a basis for providing an opinion to our colleagues in part of HUD that insures multifamily mortgages against default. And so when builders come in and apply for one of these mortgages, we provide a market analysis that is used as part of the underwriting to state whether or not we feel that there's demand for that project in that market. But it's also used by other actors in the housing market industry, state and local governments, private sector developers of single-family owner-occupied housing, multifamily developers who are not using our products from FHA or Federal Housing Administration insured loans. So I'm going to focus on one of these recent analysis that we've done for the Tampa, St. Petersburg, Clearwater, Florida market. Within the paper, one of the first things you see is a graph or a map showing where it is located in the United States. So this is in the western coast of Florida. Tampa, St. Petersburg, it's another low-lying area subject to hurricanes, but it's one of our fastest growing areas as well. So here's what we look at when we want to understand a housing market is we start with what's going on with the economy. Actually, let me back up a little. This is an overview of what's going on, a sort of a summary at the beginning of the report. We talk about the economy, what's going on in the sales market, and what's going on in the rental market. Here we have an interesting case, actually a fairly common case right now in the United States, where our sales markets are relatively tight, whereas our rental markets have become soft. In that, by tight we mean that there's more demand than supply in sales markets, but on the other hand, there's more supply than demand in many of our rental markets right now, because we've gone through the post-pandemic era of very low interest rates. This was a spur to developers to invest in multifamily housing, and this has caused a lot of recent production, and household demand for rental housing is not quite caught up with that production. So starting with the local economy, we want to know about what are the drivers of the local economy. Where is new employment coming from? What sectors are growing the fastest? What kinds of wages can we expect in these sectors that will influence the relative demand for owner and renter occupied housing? So we use a number of data sources here for measuring the local economy. One important source is covered wages and employment. This comes from our Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's based on the data that's derived from the unemployment insurance program, where the folks that may become unemployed because of being laid off from work or because their industry is contracting, they would receive unemployment insurance. Meanwhile, when they are working, they pay into this program, and that gives us a good measure of the number of employees in different industries. We also have a program, again, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics on local area unemployment, which is it's not a direct measure, but it uses a number of different measures, including the growth in payroll jobs, but also what's going on with population, and it creates sort of a model-based estimate of what local unemployment rates are. And then we also include a number of private sector reports about, like, for example, what are the largest employers in a region, what sectors they're in, and that helps us understand growth a little bit better. Next, we look at population and household trends. A major source here is our decennial census. We do every year ending in 0 in the United States. But this is a very basic survey. It asks very few questions of people. Very few questions about housing. The only questions about housing in our decennial census are whether when we survey the household, whether the unit is owned by the household or rented by the household. That's the basic question, and that's the only one we get for everybody. We also have another survey called the American Community Survey. This is a very large sample, which is done every year in the United States. About 3 million households, or a little over 2% of the households in the country, are surveyed each year, and we compile a number. This is a very wide-ranging social demographic survey, including industries and occupations of employment, deeper family structure issues, more detail on housing market, whether your housing costs, for example, are included in this survey. And so it provides us a number, deeper analysis of what's going on with households. And then we also get annual census population estimates in order to figure out what's going on in between decennial census with regard to growth. These are based on a number of administrative sources, like births and deaths as recorded by health departments, and also some information from the tax system about where people are filing their taxes. That accounts for interregional migration patterns. Next, we look at, in our analysis, we look at owner-occupied housing. From here, we get mainly private sector data sources to examine what's going on in the owner-occupied market. One of the issues, of course, with nationally produced statistics is they take a long time to get there, and a lot of times we're very interested in what's going on right at the moment. And private sector sources tend to be better at producing current information, although it may not be quite as complete with regard to coverage or as representative as we would like from a more statistically designed survey. But they do provide us with important information on trends. So for looking at owner-occupied housing, we have data sources like Redfin, which is a large online real estate brokerage. And they can tell us about what are going on with current prices, how many houses are on the market relative to, and how many houses are selling relative to how many houses are on the market, which is kind of a measure of inventory and how tight the housing market is for owner-occupied housing. Another important source is CoreLogic, which is a company that was an offshoot of a title insurance company. Now, a title insurance in the United States is a product that ensures that the ownership of land has been well established and not subject to contrary claims, and ensures against any contrary claims that had not been found through investigation of the public record. So the CoreLogic maintains, they have like a copy of local public land records, and then from that they keep track of transactions, so they can tell us about sales prices in many cases. Another source that we look at, particularly with regard to new construction, is called Zonda. This is a company that has relationships with builders, and they talk to builders a lot and understand what's going on with is particularly the large builders in terms of how many houses they're producing, and they can get down to a lot of local markets to do that. We have here this figure 11, which is talks about housing affordability, or it called the Housing Opportunity Index, although it's one of these statistics that's actually no longer in production, but one that we've been following for a number of years. But it's that comes from Wells Fargo, which is a large originator of mortgages. as well as the National Association of Home Builders, one of the important lobby groups in Washington, which represents the interests of home builders. And all of these organizations produce statistics. We can draw on those statistics for our analysis of what's going on in housing markets. So here's a little bit more on owner-occupied housing, on production, on prices, and on the nature of sales. I have drawn a couple of other from the Las Vegas market, looking at the differences in types of sales. And this is an interesting one because it captures the end of the Great Recession, the housing crisis, where in the United States and particularly in Las Vegas, we had a huge number of foreclosures. And this graph, which is sourced by I can't read that one. CoreLogic. Oh yeah, this one comes from CoreLogic. Talks about the real estate owned, that is the houses that had been foreclosed on and then had to be resold in the market. And you can see as those trail off, we see prices improving or prices increasing in the market and coming back to prior levels. This graph is interesting because it also includes the interest rate, and you can see as interest rates decline, we have spikes in housing sales. As interest rates rise, housing sales decline. There's two reasons for that. One is that, of course, higher mortgage rates impact demand, but they also impact supply because a lot of homeowners have mortgages, and if their mortgage rates are particularly low compared to what's available on the market now, it discourages them from moving, and so we see a drop-off in the number of homes that come on the market, and then this leads, of course, to market tightness and continued rising prices. Finally, we have an important public sector source for housing supply comes from our Census Bureau's building permit survey. This survey goes to the local permitting agencies that decide, that issue the permits for construction, and provides counts of units that are intended for owner occupancy and intended for rent. And then we can see that we had a tremendous spike in permitting, coincident with, including the post-pandemic era when we had a lot of very low interest rates, but that's coming down now. Again, this is demand-driven mostly, but also to some extent supply, because builders have to borrow money too while housing is in production. And then finally, our rental market analysis. Here we rely on a good number of public sector sources. Again, the American Community Survey provides this table here, which talks about the different kinds of housing, rental housing units by structure. We see here, this market's Tampa, St. Petersburg. There's a lot of single family detached and attached rental housing, which is different from in other markets where multifamily units of 5+ or more in larger buildings tend to predominate. So this is a market that we have to also not only keep track of what's going on with the multifamily, which is covered by a lot of private sources. For example, CoStar Group is a wide-ranging private sector survey that repeatedly goes back to multifamily housing, but also includes some smaller managed housing. There's other surveys that or other sources of data for rental housing that we use include RealPage, which is this is a company that provides management software to multifamily owners or multifamily property managers to manage their affairs, collect rents, manage vacant units, etc. It's software that they use to manage their project, but the company then can draw the data out of it and understand what's going on with vacancies, with rents, and then we can purchase data from them and understand what rental trends are like in various markets. Now, of course, that kind of a survey is not complete. It's only from the clients of this company. However, it does provide interesting information on trends and is very current. Whereas our American Community Survey data here, we see the latest we have is 2022. That's always going to be about 2 years behind where we are, because it's a large national survey that needs to be tabulated, and that takes time. So in order to have more current information, we have this mix of data from public sources, which provide the complete information, and then we use private sources in a lot of cases to trend things forward, to figure out, okay, well, if this is the baseline that we have from the national public sector source, if it grew at this rate, what would it be now? And very often these private data sources give us really good information in terms of measuring how things are going to change in the public sources as things go forward. Okay, one more look at what we concerned about in renter-occupied housing. How are the lower income folks faring in the rental market? This data is a comprehensive housing affordability strategy data, where we compare what's going on with the with incomes and rents, which we can get from the American Community Survey. But what we do is we compare the household's income to an income standard for each area based on median family income. And in this case, we're looking at very low income renters. Those are below 50% of the area median family income. And of course, we see that they have much higher severe housing cost burdens than folks that have in general, the renter households in general. And then this graph on the right measures affordability, rental affordability, and we had a spike in rental demand that occurred during immediately after the COVID pandemic, as people moved around, sought more space because they were working from home, etc. Those rent changes are still working their way through the system, and this is impacting rental affordability, even though incomes of renters are recovering as well. All right, so those are the kind of sources that go into our comprehensive housing market analysis when we're looking at local areas. We also produce a number of national housing statistics data sets that go more deeply into housing conditions. For example, the American Housing Survey, that's probably our most important one. It's definitely our largest survey. This is a survey that goes back to the same units every 2 years and traces what's been happening to them. Even if they have different occupants, we will continue to survey what's going on with the housing unit for a period of 10 years. So going back every 2 years during a 10-year period, and see whether people have remodeled things, whether the unit has gone from rental to owner or owner to rental, how much has the rental or owner cost increased, that kind of information. It also includes very detailed housing characteristics, things like what's used for fuel for heating, whether there's air conditioning, central air or window air conditioning units. Also information on the neighborhood conditions, what are people's opinions of the neighborhood, and so it's very detailed, and we also often will throw in what we call topical modules into the survey that we will ask on special topics, like what was your reason for moving? We're looking at doubling up, for example, to try to suss out not the direct homeless problem of people in shelters or on the street, but people that are crowding in their housing units because of economic conditions. Another big survey we do is a rental housing finance survey. In the United States, there's plenty of data available on the finance of owner-occupied housing because we have big sources like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are secondary market institutions. They release a lot of data on mortgages. Mortgage Bankers does a survey of mortgage delinquency, so we understand how many people might be defaulting on mortgages. So there's a lot of information on that, but not so much on the sources of capital for rental housing finance. So we conduct a special survey there where we contact the owners and managers of rental housing and ask them where they got the source of where they got their funds to finance their investment in rental housing. Then we participate with our Commerce Department in the survey of construction, where we get building permits, as I mentioned earlier. Also, it follows from the building permits. It takes a sample and counts the number of housing starts through completions. And then also we look at single-family sales in this survey. Then we have another survey of market absorption, which follows multifamily units. When they're completed, we look at how long it takes for, if they're condominiums, how long it takes for them to be sold, and how long for rental markets it takes for the units to be rented out. Also, we have a special survey for a particular segment of our market, manufactured housing, the manufactured housing survey. This looks at a particular type of housing in the United States, which is regulated at the national level because these are housing units that can be transported across state lines. And so rather than having local authority over the building permits and the construction standards, we have a national standard, and we also do a survey about where these units are being placed in the United States. And then I mentioned some of the administrative data we have that comes from various sources. There's a couple that are produced, 3 that are produced by HUD directly. One is our picture of subsidized households. This looks at folks that are in one of the various housing subsidy programs that are run by HUD, the public housing, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and project-based rental assistance. We compile statistics on the households and produce data about their incomes, for example, their race and ethnicity, and how much rent they're paying toward their housing units, and how much it costs in total for the government. Then we have a public use microdata sample of our subsidized households that are available, that we make available to researchers who want to look at, do more in-depth analysis of what's going on with tenants, using regression techniques, maybe data matching, et cetera. We also collect data on a program that's not run by HUD, but is a very important program in the United States for producing a relatively affordable housing through a tax credit scheme, a low-income housing tax credit. We collect data on the projects that are produced, as well as the tenants that are living in those housing units, to understand a little bit of their demography. Produced by there's other data sets that are produced by our friends at the Federal Housing Finance Administration. This is the agency that regulates Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the secondary market institutions, as well as the federal home loan banks. That group produces a national mortgage database, which is derived initially from credit bureau records of mortgages, and then follows them through time to see whether or not they've defaulted or when they've been paid off, and gives us very important insights on mortgage performance. And they also produce a very detailed level house price index, all the way down to postal codes in the United States, to measure house price trends geographically for owner-occupied housing. So I hope this gives you a good overview of how we put together, different data sources to get to the analysis that we need in the United States. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive, as you say, overview of what you're doing, where you're pulling the really various data sources well together. I think it's also interesting. We went from the global to the national to you took us to the local level to understand what is happening there. We learned a new acronym, CHMA, Comprehensive Housing Market Analysis, and I really liked also your reference to our website, because even if we may not have a lot of time to discuss here, there's a lot of material on our website which the participants in this webinar can access. So I very briefly open the floor. We are running a little bit behind. I see one question. I see also some exchanges in the chat on previous presentations, but I give the floor to Daniela for a question on this presentation.
Hi, Mr. Obzovsky. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really, really comprehensive. You covered a lot of ground there. I guess I was just wondering about your last point on the use of administrative data, because I work for Statistics Canada, and we've done quite a lot of work on trying to use property assessment and land transfer tax information to come up with estimates. So I was just wondering, how much has it been a challenge for your organization to access administrative data? We have found that being the biggest, I guess, obstacle that we have faced in using administrative data for housing purposes. It was accessing this data from the different provinces and territories that are governed by different legislature and so on. Once we got access to the data, it wasn't so hard to translate it into statistics. But I was just wondering if you face some of that in your situation. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a common issue with federal countries where the state or the provincial governments have their own authority. The data sets, the administrative data sets I was talking about, are all national data sets. So the participants in even though these programs are administered by local governments or private sector owners, in the case of project-based rental assistance, they're required to report the data on the tenants and their other activities to the national government. So we're able to build the data set out of that. And maybe I think probably the Census Bureau's building permit survey is the closest analog to what you're talking about, because that is actually dealing with the local administrators of the building permit systems. And so, but it's been fairly well established, and they have a very good coverage. I believe it's something like 80% of the population is covered by people or agencies that submit building permit data to the Census Bureau. There are some issues with it. From time to time, we find that, for example, if the building permit process is sort of a revenue component for a local government, an important revenue source, but they're building, for example, tax credit housing, subsidized housing, they may underreport the number of units that they're producing. So they charge for 1 unit of building permit rather than 200 units. And so you get an undercount, interesting undercount there, but we've figured out a way to understand what's really going on. That's kind of in rare cases in certain jurisdictions. But it's always a challenge there's always a challenge of dealing with governments that have their own authority when you're trying to put together this administrative data. And I don't know that I have any sort of tips or pointers, but be nice to them. Yeah.
Thanks.
I think that last advice works universally if you seek partnerships and cooperation. So thanks very much for drilling down into the data, because after all, you're talking to a bunch of statisticians here and data people. and we are still under the session of looking at the user needs, and it's also interesting for us to see how you access and use and mix various data sources and evaluate their relevance and usefulness for you. So thank you for that presentation. We have to move on. And
Stefan,
to the
yes, Stefan, sorry. I think there's a question in the chat for the HUD by
okay,
Emily.
okay. I did not see that. Thanks, Benson, for helping with that.
Yeah, I will read the question. What data does HUD collect on disability issues and the accessibility of housing units? Thanks.
Oh, yeah, thank you for the question. The best probably source of that is our American Housing Survey. We, from time to time, have include accessibility topical data collections. I believe we've done some in a couple of years recently where we ask about the characteristics of housing and ask about the disability status of the residents in more detail. The American Community Survey, which is the larger demographic survey, also collects information on disability. So that's a source for understanding the demand. What the American Housing Survey allows us to do is understand whether or not that demand is being met by the housing stock. And of course, it's not very well met, but it is improving over time.
So thank you for that question, and thank you for your answer. And thanks you also, Benson, to help me to keep an eye on the chat here. So if there are no further questions on this presentation by Dr. Usovsky, we'll move on to the next and final presentation under the session 2, which is a presentation on the use of housing data in the Reserve Bank of Australia for monitoring and research purposes. And we have Jonathan Hambur here to make that presentation and share his work as a senior research manager in the economics research department of the Bank of Australia. And he is leading the microanalysis and data stream, and he previously held positions in domestic markets and international departments, as well as he played a role in the Australian Treasury, leading its microdata analysis term. So clearly a data and analysis background that leads you to this presentation. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for having me here tonight to present. It's a real honor to present at such a distinguished forum. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm presenting tonight. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. So I'm going to present on uses of housing data at the Reserve Bank. So this is going to take a bit more of a macro view after the slightly more kind of micro view that we've just heard from, though I'll kind of turn back to that micro view a little bit more at the end, because that's actually becoming an increasingly important way that even as a central bank, we have to start to think about housing markets. And so in terms of a little bit of signposting and overview, I'll start by just kind of talking about why, as a central bank, we think about housing market dynamics, why they're important from our standpoint as a policymaker. I'll then talk about how we use all of the macroeconomic data to understand market dynamics, that purpose, and then kind of, as I said, turn a bit more to that micro view to think about emerging opportunities that are helping us understand the economy and kind of causal mechanisms a lot better. So why does housing markets matter to a central bank? We can kind of think of three key reasons. There's the real economy aspect, there's kind of the nominal, the inflation aspect, and there's also the balance sheet aspect. On that real aspect, housing market and housing sector is a really important driver of aggregate economic activity. So it's a very sizable component of activity, but it's also actually one of the more responsive components in response to monetary policy. So you can see that in this chart that I'm showing here. So what this is some output from one of our main macroeconomic models at the Reserve Bank, Dynamic Stochastic General Equilibrium, or DSGE model. So what I'm showing here is the response of different sectors of the economy to a monetary policy shock and increase in interest rates across a few different sectors, both in terms of value added and investment. You can really see here that our models really show that kind of the housing sector is a really important channel through which monetary policy affects the economy. So it's important for us to understand it from that standpoint. In terms of that nominal, that inflation aspect, rents and new housing, new dwelling purchases are an important and sizable component of our CPI basket, as you can see here. So this chart kind of decomposes CPI inflation into the different components, and you can see that particularly in recent period, those kind of housing components, the new dwelling purchases and the rents, have playing an increasingly important role in kind of inflation dynamics. The other really important thing to note here is actually rents are quite persistent. So because they're reset very irregularly, kind of people's rents might only change once every year, they can be quite lagging and quite persistent. So that kind of persistence and lagging aspect can be really important for us in thinking about what's going to happen to inflation dynamics going forwards. And then turning to that kind of that balance sheet aspect, obviously housing is a very important component of people's balance sheets, both on the asset side but also on the liability side. So this shows some information on the composition of household net worth in Australia from one of the surveys provided by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, who I should have thanked at the start because they provide much of the data that I'm going to talk about today. We can see that, unsurprisingly, particularly kind of for mortgages and outright owners, housing plays is a very large share of kind of net wealth, both in terms of kind of a share of their assets, but also actually as the overall size of the economy. And that is, as I said, both on the asset side, as you can kind of see here in the pink, but also in the liabilities, the debt side. That means that kind of housing market dynamics can have very big macroeconomic effects, for example, by affecting people's wealth and therefore their decisions about what they can afford to consume, but also because of financial and macro stability implications in terms of debt ability to repay, aspects like that. So that's why it's important to us, but how do we actually use data to think about what's happening in housing markets? So I'll first talk a little bit about kind of that real side. So it's very important for us to be able to forecast, for example, housing construction activity, to think about, well, what's the demand for labor going to be, what's the demand, overall demand in the economy, and therefore kind of inflationary dynamics, GDP, etc. So this chart on the right shows how we can kind of go around thinking about that, building that up. So it shows in the first panel just information from the ABS on approvals for buildings, commencements, and also completions. Having all those aspects together is really valuable because it not only allows us to see kind of what activity is being done in terms of those completions, but also allows us to build up a kind of a pipeline of the amount of activity that's yet to be done. That can give us a much fuller picture of housing dynamics. For example, you can see recently, as interest rates have increased, approvals have fallen quite sharply over the past few years. But actually, because of previous disruptions, kind of approvals and commencements being much higher than completions, we've actually got quite a large pipeline yet to be worked through. So while approvals are low, actual activity may stay higher going forward than it would have otherwise because we have that large pipeline. So kind of being able to see all these aspects at both the commencements and kind of that stock lets us get a much better sense of what's actually going to happen going forward, which is important for policy. On that kind of nominal side, obviously in trying to understand prices, trying to understand inflation, we really need to understand that balance between the supply and demand. You can see that very clearly here in this kind of pretty simple chart that just shows that the rent component of the CPI, which I was talking about earlier, alongside a measure of tightness in rental markets. And this comes from a mix of ABS data and a private source, a private sector firm. We can see that, unsurprisingly, markets get tighter, vacancy rates go down, prices are higher. So understanding that balance of supply and demand is very important. I already talked a little bit about the supply aspect, kind of completions, buildings, etc. So what about the demand? How do we start to think about that? Well, there's two kind of very important drivers of kind of housing demand you might think about. One is population, unsurprisingly, but another is also how large household sizes are. So kind of if household sizes are larger or less equal, you need less houses for number of people. So population growth statistics provided by the ABS directly. But one thing that we've actually been developing, actually somewhat surprisingly from our labour force statistics, as I understand it, is more high frequency measures of household size. And that's what I'm showing in the top panel here. What those have really allowed us to see is there's been quite a substantial shift down in average household size since around COVID. And that's meant that that's actually pushed up housing demand a fair bit more than we would have expected, purely based on population growth. So understanding that's kind of given us a lot better sense of what's happened to demand. So what happens when we pull those two things together? Well, we can get a really good balance a really good sense of the balance of supply and demand, or at least how that's changing. So kind of this is putting those two things together. The purple line, just the completions from before, and the grey line, a range of estimates of kind of that change in demand. And what you can really see is that in the recent period, particularly under the last year or so, demand has picked up substantially more than completions, and that's kind of been contributing to higher rental price and house price inflation. So that's kind of how we've used a lot of these data sets to now very much focusing on the macro. As I said, one area where there's a lot of emerging opportunities and we're making a lot more use of is kind of granular data, because they allow us to tell much deeper stories, understand what's happening, but also kind of tease out causal mechanisms, understanding the effects of policy, things like that. So a really nice example of that is shown in this chart. So this is using some really detailed rental data that we've been working with at the Bureau of Statistics to access. We've actually kind of agreement level, rental agreement level data that they've gotten access to. What we've then used that to do is to look at rent price growth at a very fine geographic disaggregation, and then kind of plotted that based on the distance to the central business district in our two biggest cities, Sydney and Melbourne. What you can see, and I think very consistent with a lot of other countries, during kind of the peak of the COVID pandemic, rents in close to CBDs fell sharply and picked up in kind of outer suburbs. And then subsequently, we've seen a lot of that reverse, particularly kind of in those CBD areas. So being able to kind of draw out those stories gives us a much better sense of kind of, gives us a richer picture of what's really happening, kind of understand the dynamics below the macro numbers. So as well as those granular data can also help us think about policy effects. So a really good example of that is some work some colleagues of mine did using detailed geographic house price data to think about, well, does monetary policy affect house prices differently depending on the nature of the area? In particular, what I'm showing here is some of the work they did looking at how the effects of monetary policy differ based on kind of whether the area was one with tending to have higher prices and higher incomes. What they found is that actually house prices in kind of higher income areas were much more responsive to monetary policy. So they're much higher elasticity. That's really useful for us to understand because it has implications for a few things. One thing, it has implications for thinking about at least the cyclical effects of monetary policy on wealth inequality, which is going to be potentially interesting from a policy standpoint, but also from a more general standpoint. It also helps us think about wealth effects. So you might think if the lowest income people have their housing wealth shift a lot more in response to policy, they might be more responsive. compared to high income people who might be better able to smooth through fluctuations in their wealth because they're not credit constrained, things like that. So kind of these findings suggest that the wealth effect may be a little bit less substantial, so how much people respond in terms of consumption to changes in their housing wealth, than it would be if kind of if low income housing was much more responsive in terms of prices. So that's useful for us to understand that from a kind of policy pass-through standpoint. One other area where I've been doing a lot of work with our Bureau of Statistics is also to actually integrate more housing data into administrative data sets, for example, administrative tax data sets, aspects like that. And that's becoming a really increasingly powerful tool for understanding the economy, as understanding policy. So a good example of that's some ongoing work we've been doing, looking at a bit of a story that often passes through the economy. So there's kind of a prevailing wisdom amongst some people that higher interest rates can actually pass through to higher rent because landlords might actually pass that on to renters. So that's not generally how we think kind of rental markets work, but it's something that is in kind of in some people's minds. So one thing we did is we actually went to try to test this directly. So we used some administrative tax data that we have access to in a de-identified way, which is actually integrated to kind of rental incomes. And we're able to look at, well, when interest rates change, do leveraged landlords and non-leveraged landlords behave differently? Do you actually see this pass through? And we actually found no evidence that kind of higher interest payments are actually passed on to the end renters. That's really, as I said, very important for us to understand for policy, because if it's actually not the case, if higher interest rates did pass to higher rents, that's obviously going to offset some of the intended power of monetary policy in pushing down inflation. And these type of integrated data sets is actually somewhere where a lot of work is ongoing with the ABS, Bureau of Statistics, to kind of build these out so we can have a lot more powerful understanding of the economy. But I'll just sum up there. We know, as I've kind of said, that housing markets are going to be very important considerations for a central bank. Good data on kind of prices and activity are really crucial for us to understand those macro dynamics. But these emerging granular and integrated data sets really give us a lot more analytical firepower that we're increasingly using to understand the economy. So I'll leave it there, but happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for this detailed presentation. And I also always like, I'm a big fan of geostatistics when people look at the connection between numerical data and the geospatial dimension. So it was interesting to listen to that part of your presentation from my perspective. Okay, we have a little bit of time for questions. Is there anybody who would like to raise their hand, or let me double check whether there's something in the chat?
Stefan, I think there's one from Laura Murphy because it was entered when Jonathan was making his presentation.
Okay.
Jonathan, you may want to look at the chat. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, can you read it?
Sorry.
Yeah, sure. I'll read it. Jonathan, if you can't see it, I'll read it. Is it okay? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay. A key underlying trend impacting rights holders is the financialization of housing. How are supply and demand calculations being adjusted to reflect this phenomenon and the impact on households unable to access adequate housing choices?
So I think, there's a few different aspects to that. So I think obviously the financial aspects of housing are very important. So kind of understanding the debt dynamics is really crucial. I think we kind of, particularly in our financial stability areas, look at those in a lot of different lenses, both kind of using bank data and kind of loan level data, and really monitoring for aspects of stress, but also availability. So those are very important aspects that kind of thought about a little bit separately, but they obviously have a lot of crossover and interrelations to it.
I might
Yes,
speak a little bit on that question about financialization. One thing in the United States we're seeing is more institutional ownership of single-family rental housing in numerous markets, and we are one aspect of that, of course, is we tend to get better data on rental housing that's institutionally managed than housing that's owned and operated by small landlords, people that own 2 or 3 different houses and rent them out. Whereas with larger landlords, we can tend to be into these into data systems where we can get information about how they're behaving with regard to rents and vacancy. So you can get a little bit better picture of it. And so, but we are keeping track of institutional ownership in rental housing in particular.
Thank you for coming in also on this question. There was one question also. I would be very interested in housing market models in informal areas. Is there anybody who would, Jonathan or Kurt, would like to speak to that?
We don't have, this is informal settlements are an issue in very few parts of the United States, usually around the Mexico border. Although it's not, it was more of an issue in earlier years. I think we're getting better at understanding what's going on. They are included in our census data products because we try to understand or understand where all the housing units are as part of the decennial census, and then follow up with the American Community Survey. So there is a way of doing this, so long as we can capture some idea of location and address of the informal settlements as they become better established. But perhaps that's more something that's easier in the United States, where there aren't very many of them, and it's easier for them to be integrated into the more mainstream housing system.
Thank you for that comment. There is also one comment here. Let me just also pass it on to Jonathan, which is more a comment than a question. Says, thanks from Andrew Moore. Some powerful analysis to contest assumptions, rate pass-through impacts and elasticity dynamics in response to monetary policy. So thanks for this sharing this analysis. So that was indeed very interesting. As we are a little bit behind, surely it shows the reaction in the chat and the questions that there are many dimensions that can and will have to be discussed. So we are on the right track with opening these discussions. So let me perhaps then close the session number 2 and also to give some time to session number 3. And thank all the presenters for building the case for housing statistics and understanding the user needs, very different user needs that we heard and that whet our appetite and set the stage for moving to session 3, now a housing framework for the future, where we will talk about a conceptual framework for housing statistics. And as I will have to unfortunately leave very shortly, I have the competent assistance and help by our dear colleague and friend Jonathan Coe from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, who will take over the chairing of session 3 and then the concluding summary reflections at the end. So thank you again to all the presenters, and thank you to all of you for connecting. And I hand over the baton to you, Jonathan.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Stefan, it's very great to take over in your shoes for this summer for this webinar. I'm coming to you from Turrbal and Jagera country in Brisbane, and just wanted to recognise elders past and present and any members of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander and also Indigenous people from around the world who may be joining us at the meeting here today. So Stefan's given a really great introduction to this session, which is really around talking about a housing framework for the future. And the previous session has discussed, really given us the case as to why integrated housing is important, and in some respects also how housing data is used, both public, private, and subnational data. This session's really trying to sort of take that, I think, to the next sort of logical step to think about what might a framework that describes what an integrated housing information data set might look like, and conceptual the concepts that are going to be required behind it, and how it could be assembled to answer some of those really challenging questions that were posed in the previous session. So to do that, we have a presentation from Dr. Jean-Philippe Deschamps-Leporte, and the presentations on a conceptual framework for housing statistics, bridging social, economic, and environmental statistics. Jean-Philippe is an Assistant Director in the Centre for Income and Social Wellbeing Statistics at Statistics Canada. He's in charge of the agency's work in relation to housing conditions and housing markets, including homelessness and social housing, some of the issues that have been discussed in the chat I've seen as well. Over the last year, he's been leading the development of a new conceptual framework for housing statistics in Canada, and he holds a PhD in economics from Örebro University in Sweden. Apologies for my pronunciation there. Jean-Philippe, the floor is yours. I think we probably have, I think in terms of timing, let's look for around 30 minutes for your presentation. That should leave us enough time for questions and for me to wrap up. Thanks, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, everyone, for joining the meeting today. I'm pleased to join you from Quebec, Canada, on the unceded and traditional land of the Anishinaabe people. It's a wonderful opportunity to come and speak to this very broad group, and I'm really excited to see the discussions in the chat and through the Q&A. So I hope to further contribute to the reflection. So at Statistics Canada, we have a large ecosystem of data program. Some of them have a long history. Census of population has been around since the 19th century, and so we have certain elements that have been there for a very long time. But over the last 7 years or so, there's been an increase in our coverage of questions around housing. And on the left-hand side, that's maybe largely more our social emphasis on housing question, and on the right-hand side, maybe more the economic questions. And I ran out of space, so there's even some at the bottom of this slide. So you see that each program has a particular emphasis, whether it's on prices, whether it's on economic activity, whether it's on values of residential property. But at the end of the day, once you have this ecosystem, once you have further...
He's called an ecosystem an ecosystem. He's French.
Yeah, you can tell by his accent regardless.
I'm sorry, thank you. So at the end of the day, you have sort of an increase of coverage of concepts, but there needs to be a degree of organization of this information and a blueprint for the future. So that's the context we're in, and that the original motivation for our work at the agency. So I think the previous presenters have made the case for housing being a complex system of information that involves numerous actors, whether they're from the public, the private, the nonprofit sector, and it's fundamentally cross-cutting. So you can't look at housing just from a demographic perspective, not just from a national accounting perspective. There's a whole continuum of information, and it makes it challenging for a national statistical organization to have a good grasp, to be ready for the challenges of tomorrow. So that's really the sort of the genesis of our reflection. To add to this complexity, we don't have the monopoly as a national statistical organization of the information on housing. I think Dr. Osofsky previously talked about the realities of having all sorts of non-governmental actors being the holder and the producer of official information on housing. So that's the case in Canada as well. We have real estate boards, we have other agencies within the government who are helping support the production of official statistics on housing. So what I'm going to present today is a first iteration of our reflection on how to organize these concepts and how to think about things where we have never measured, but they matter in understanding housing from different perspectives. So the first purpose is really to organize our current work. The second is to deliver deeper insights. So to focus on a particular trend, let's say homeownership going down in Canada, on its own, just to have that number going down is not entirely insightful. We need to bring this in the context of fertility, of migration, of building wealth. So to have these broader perspective on particular trend is where we're trying to go when it comes to analysis and storytelling. And to grow is just to think about things like climate change, green finance, natural disaster, the demographic changes that are evolving quite rapidly in Canada, and to be able to respond and to grow our statistical programming to address these particular challenges. So there is a fair number of statistical frameworks out there. Quality of life in Canada is something rather recent from a couple of years ago. National accounting has a very long history in terms of conceptual framework. Health in Canada, we also have environmental accounting. So there's quite a few, but to the best of our knowledge, there is no blueprint to organize housing, often because it's nested elsewhere, but for the questions, the policy we're trying to help support, there's this need to put certain elements together. So the OECD did a wonderful agenda for a few years, the Horizontal Housing Project, and they had sort of elements of it. Stats New Zealand had a specific emphasis on housing quality. So we're working from there and sort of proposing a new approach. So today we're going to focus on the elements on the left-hand side of this slide, which is really setting the scope, layering and classifying concepts, and we're not necessarily going to go to the level of indicators or gap analysis because that would be a full-day workshop. The structure of what I'm proposing to you is derived in large part from the policy world, where oftentimes policymakers wish to display a theory of change. So let's say we want to reduce poverty. We're going to start here. It's going to influence the following, and there's a sequence of events. So that's a little bit the thinking we're borrowing here, the logical model to explain the housing system. So it's an exercise of simplification. If we were to actually pinpoint where prices, interest rates, immigration plays a role, then it would be a very, very complex system of information. So the analogy that I'm asking you to use to understand what I'm going to present is, let's say you're opening a piece of hardware, like a computer, the actual physical aspect, and you look at the circuit board. So today we're going to make abstraction of the circuits, and we're just going to look at the components of the circuit to ensure that as a statistical organization, we have what is required to understand housing. So obviously, if one person is interested in rights-based approach to housing, of inflation, the indicators and the concepts might come in a different order, but at the end of the day is our coverage of the concepts that we are trying to ensure at this point. So it's an exercise of simplification. In terms of scope, housing being cross-cutting, being sort of an important component of national accounting, of individual outcomes, it's often looked at from one specific perspective. So what we're proposing is housing as a confluence of factors. Society being one factor. And by society, we just don't mean people. We mean household, we mean neighborhoods, we mean communities, the way people assemble. We look at housing from an economic perspective, and that encompasses the idea of markets, choice, risks, trade-offs, and prices, obviously. And we also include and we elevate to the same level the environmental factors. Maybe historically, it's been an emphasis that hasn't been as great as the social and the economic factor, but we all see the impact of climate change. We think a lot more about energy efficiency. We think a lot more about the physical aspect of housing, which is why we're proposing to elevate the environmental factor to the same level as the social and economic factor. And by environmental, we don't mean just natural element. We mean the built environment. We mean the physical aspect of housing and its interaction with the natural environment as well. So we have those three factors that get together and provide this broad perspective on housing. Because it's very complex, you'll see the next slide has a lot of content. We first take a pause and layer the emerging themes that we observe. It's naturally centered on the Canadian dynamics, but maybe could be useful for other countries as well, in terms of themes and where Canada is when it comes to policy focus. So looking at the economic factors, we see that there are very strong questions around the private and the public economics of home building. I think in introduction, Mr. Milnar was talking about 96,000 dwellings being needed to be built every day. We have similar reflections in Canada, but we need to think, okay, how are they going to be built from sort of a labor input and sort of productivity perspective? And there's also the public. How can municipalities support the infrastructure and provide the right incentives for this home building? Being an important component of economic activity brings question of macroeconomic activity and risks. So those are predominant sort of emphasis from the economic lens. On the social side, in the Canadian context, aging, immigration, demographic changes are a very important underpinning of social question as they relate to housing. We just don't build homes, we build communities, and the price setting results in affordability, and the lack of affordability has all sorts of social consequences that can influence social mobility as well through generation and over one's life's course as well. And lastly, from the environmental factor, the emerging questions that we see coming out of the framework are elements of built environment and infrastructure. This, like the very physical aspect of housing, health outcomes, from the very way buildings are built, but also the way communities are built. And lastly, it's the contribution of housing to climate change and the exposure of housing to climate change as well. So moving on, we will take a more close look at the social factor. So essentially that circle from before, we're breaking down in a sequence of concepts that we propose as being relevant for the understanding of housing. The way this is framed, you will see that at level 4, those are all indicators that are borrowed from the Canadian framework on quality of life. The premise here is that the price of building material, productivity in construction don't matter on their own. They matter in the way that they influence people's quality of life. So this is how this framework is built to have at the last stage for all of the factors, you have dimensions of quality of life. It's also to make a nice connection with the existing frameworks. So at the first stage of the social dimensions, you have the basic components of demographic change: fertility, mortality, international, internal migration, household formation. So those are all classic ways to look at demography. And there's also emerging questions that are stemming from tight housing markets in Canada, being suppressed households, adult children staying with their parents because they can't afford rents or they wish to save for down payments. So new trends that are emerging from the context we're in that call for the development and the measurement of new concepts. Government policies, services, and action, that's sort of a standing item in my precondition, because that's so critical in understanding where government interact with the housing system. And a very important but seldom measured is this idea, going back to Scheller, measuring preferences and expectation of people, what they think will happen, what they wish to attain in terms of housing aspiration. So we are increasingly thinking about the measurement of these preferences and expectations because they matter. Collectively, if everyone thinks housing prices will go in a certain way, that's exactly what's going to happen. In terms of the second stage, you take these demographic components together. They result in aging, so the pyramid, and population growth. And you end up with choices of households in terms of tenure, whether they own, they rent, and features and location choice. That's maybe a dimension that maybe traditionally we haven't been great at measuring. We have been measuring number of bedrooms and size of homes. But the finishes, the location, whether you look at the housing prices and building good hedonic models, you want to know if that unit is on a corner. You would like to know if that rental apartment has nice finishes to distinguish it from a maybe more affordable but different unit. Once people age, grow, the population grows, and people sort of are allocated within the housing market, you have population clustering. People agglomerate in neighborhoods and communities. That can lead to social inclusion. That can lead to diversity, but it can also lead to segregation. Housing markets are powerful ways for populations to sort. You see this across the global north, global south. Housing markets can lead to gated community or communities where people are trying to move away from, creating heterogeneity in the housing market. Housing being typically people's most important non-financial asset can be, for those who own, an engine for social and economic mobility, and for those who don't or face barrier to attain it, can lead to different outcomes in terms of social and economic mobility. So understanding how people move across generation, if parents were tenants, can children become homeowner in their lifetime? Those are very important questions from a social perspective. We have elements of community safety, social disorder, and crime that can stem, and they're not entirely driven by housing markets, but can stem from this segregation that I was mentioning earlier. And we're trying to bring this dimension in our measurement, in our understanding, because ultimately social goods and social bads are priced in. People will pay a premium to live in safer neighborhoods, and then we're trying to bring our understanding and measurement of these questions. And ultimately, all of this wrapped together can lead to dimensions of well-being, of social cohesion and connection, economic security and deprivation. So adverse consequences being housing needs, poverty, homelessness, food insecurity, and can also lead to life satisfaction, sense of meaning, and purpose. I'm probably pressed with time, so I'm going to move quickly to the economic factors. This coming back to an earlier slide where I was saying, well, what are the big questions coming out of the framework from an economic perspective? The economics of home building from the private sector, but also from the public sector. So questions around measurement of labor, land. It's been a difficult one in Canada, clearly measuring land, what's possible and what's profitable for builders to deploy projects on, capital and building materials. Those are all the important inputs that you need to build new housing. An understanding of financing, insurance condition, incentives, fees, and regulation. It can sometimes provide barriers or a positive incentive. The understanding from a firm perspective of expectation, perception, and risk, similar to the previous slide, but brought into the world of businesses, understanding what they think. And when it comes to inflation, borrowing costs, and decisions of today are driven by their expectation of what they think is going to happen tomorrow. Macroeconomic condition, IO. In Canada, for instance, we have a lot of small building company and a few very large ones. So the way this industry is organized matters in their ability to scale up and invest in R&D and industrialize to really support housing supply targets we have set ourselves in Canada. Building technology, again, sort of tied in with this idea of the way firms behave. In Canada, we haven't seen big improvements in productivity since the 1960s. So we're thinking very hard about building technology and the way to measure it as a statistical organization. You take all these inputs together, it results in building, renovation, and investment in construction. You have other related measurement and concepts of how long it takes to build and how long it takes to get an approval for a building. Ultimately, this results naturally in rent levels, ownership costs, and other related concepts of assessment value and replacement costs. So ultimately, those are the measurement coming out of this system in terms of pricing and values. New questions that have emerged over the last year. I think some colleagues have raised a question on financialization, is the role of investors as supporter of new construction, but also questions around behavior and what's their impact on housing markets. A big question, very difficult not to crack in Canada. It's developers and builders' profit margin. What their business plans are like and what conditions are they looking for to get in. That's a big piece. We can measure this at a wide scale in terms of financial statement, but it's a big questions that are emerging from the current context we're in and that are triggering additional consideration on new measurement. Productivity, big question in Canada, I mentioned already. You put all of these things together and then you end up with the composition of the flow of new buildings and then the stock. You have questions around saving, mortgage indebtedness, macroeconomic activity, and stability of the economy, household consumption, the use of dwelling, emerging question around short-term rental, vacant dwellings. You see particular trends in inventories building in certain segments. So really better understanding and moving beyond owner-occupied, renter-occupied to understand the use of the stock as a whole. Questions of municipal revenues and costs. They're big players. They're not thought of very regularly in the Canadian context and their ability to support housing construction. All of this wrapped together results in wealth, financial well-being, life satisfaction, and sense of meaning from a well-being perspective. Last point on environmental factors and dimension. This really, as I was mentioning earlier, bringing the environmental dimension to the same level as economic and social dimensions. Starting point being the natural geography, pollution, and the exposure of housing to climate change, where the housing is in relation to these other elements that I've just mentioned, the rules that manage the way we have been building in the past and we have to build right now, zoning, different set of rules from a municipal perspective. A dimension that we typically don't think about, is very hard also to measure, is architectural and design choices. Experts in the health domain think about the way people interact, the neuroscience of people interacting with their housing and their well-being and health that can stem from these choices we make in a private way and collectively. These factors lead to the incidence of natural disaster, GHG emission from residential housing, both in the construction phase. Concrete is a very important emitter of GHG gases, and during operation through heating and cooling. The location of homes lead to the understanding of the proximity of housing to amenities, infrastructure, jobs, green spaces. So it's rethinking about the physical aspect of housing and the measurement of these things. Energy efficiency of homes is a big question in Canada, also a big question when it comes to measurement and the exposure of housing to pollutants. So I'm not really talking about the measurement of these concepts, because again, they would take the whole day. But for most of these elements, we have made some progress in the last year, and it's sort of our agenda of measurement, thinking a system as a whole rather than looking at it one specific area. Components lead to questions of density and sprawl, the way environment and the periphery, so the peri-urban natural element, the biodiversity in the cities and just at the boundary of the city. Naturally, once you think about the location of housing, you think about the infrastructure of transportation, mobility, and the way people have accessibility in terms of physical limitation, but also accessing necessities like healthy foods. We have elements of cultural adequacy. It was mentioned many times previously today, very difficult concept to measure, but that's at the forefront of our reflection in how to build homes that are adequate for the culture of the people living therein. And lastly, the incidence of environment risk, which whether it's in exposure of things like asbestos, radon in Canada is a big question, and then risks stemming from climate change as well in terms of floods and wildfires. Going to wrap up with my last slide. So again, a lot of content. It's our blueprint to understand, okay, do we have the right concepts right now to measure the challenges of tomorrow, to inform policy that we know is coming. So we are going to map these concepts to indicators, our data holdings, and identify the gaps and give certain weights on those gaps to inform our data development initiatives. We're also working on improved governance, because beyond the data development, bringing like Statistics Canada is a large statistical agency. It allows us to improve the governance internally and externally. As I was mentioning earlier, there's a lot of external partners. And we're working on horizontal analysis that really leverage this framework. I mentioned flood hazard. That's a project we're doing right now, taking GIS information from more the natural perspective and bringing this on our integrated microdata program on housing. Similarly, we're looking at different projects on the financial drivers and outcomes of homelessness experiences and eviction in the same way, bringing different perspective, different data, and telling more compelling stories. Jonathan, over to you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present our reflection.
Thank you so much, Jean-Philippe. I think almost, I would say, inspirational presentation there in terms of the framework that you've outlined. As someone who also works in the National Statistics Office, really trying to understand how we can get some of these deeper insights is very, very important. And I think the way that you sort of explained this as a sort of a logical model to explain the housing system, I think really well explains how this could be something that is broadly implemented. I also like how you were able to elevate, I think was the word you used, around the environmental side, again, and sort of linking that with the social and economic. So we have about 12 minutes left in the webinar, and so if people have any questions, please raise your hand, and happy to give the floor over to you for those questions. While I'm doing that, there's a couple of comments in the chat to mention. So one participant said, "I'm so happy to see these diagrams. We're working on a similar project right now." I guess this sort of multi-dimensional aspect of housing is becoming increasingly important from a policy setting perspective. Thanks so much for the comprehensive presentation covering as well various social, health and environmental dimensions of housing, including exposure to risk. Thank you, Mr. Deschamps-Laporte, for sharing this comprehensive and inspiring approach. Thank you for the presentation. Can you speak to how Statistics Canada work in this area has been influenced by Canada's domestic legislation to implement the human right to adequate housing? That's perhaps a good question that you might want to respond to, Jean-Philippe.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Emily, for the question. Naturally, we don't operate in a vacuum. Just the way this webinar was set up, first talking about user need, we come from the same perspective. So naturally, as Canada has embraced a rights-based approach to housing, we are there. We typically always have to play catch up, which is part of the reason we designed this framework. Because it takes time to build quality statistics. So having an understanding of the world allows us to maybe, hopefully, take some headway in measuring things so that when policymakers, when people who are right at the forefront, like Emily, need certain information to inform policy, in this particular case, to what degree are we implementing a rights-based approach to housing, then we are there to inform them. So naturally, this is a conversation that is happening, and we operate very closely with the people at the forefront of the policymaking world.
Well said, Jean-Philippe, and I think that's very much part of most national statistics officers' way of operating is to make sure that we are at that sort of interface, because again, making sure that what we are producing is policy relevant is critical to make sure that the information that we're providing provides that sort of broader benefit. So thanks, Emily, for the question. Maria has a question. Can you speak about the potential you see for this type of framework beyond Canada and to perhaps more of a global scale?
It's an excellent question, a difficult one. This is a relatively new initiative. We began this journey about a year ago, and there's still additional work to be done to flesh out the indicators, to really think about measurement, which maybe I'm stealing some of your closing remarks, Jonathan, is part of the reflection of upcoming webinar for the sprint of like, okay, we have the concepts, how can we move forward from a very concrete standpoint? So it would be wonderful if these reflections can help support discussion and the establishment of other frameworks at a global stage. I don't think we're there at this very moment, but we're there to support.
Yes, I think well said, Jean-Philippe. I was in my mind, I was thinking when I said that this was a very inspirational sort of presentation, I think probably the word aspirational came to mind as well in the same way, because as you sort of say, I think there is a lot of information that when you look at the potential that you're looking at across those sort of social, environmental, and economic dimensions, we're covering a lot of potential ground, and so being able to get that, I think, is something that is important. But I would also say that again, as good statisticians, making sure that we have a good set of concepts as a starting point is really critical, so that we know and agree on what we measure, and hence I think where the question was coming from. So thank you for that, Maria. Maria also has a follow-on question. Also curious to know how the housing continuum connects with this framework.
And here I take that the housing critique refers from to the idea of like homelessness to, let's say, assisted living, and then everything in between. It's one natural element that comes under tenure. I've not provided the full detail of emergency shelter, transitional housing, social housing, but that's included in that particular question. But a very important question, and thank you for raising that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean-Philippe. And Laura's provided a bit of background as well in the chat for some more detail on what she was asking about when there was a question around financialization. So thank you for the extra information there, Laura. If there's no more questions, I might look to make some closing remarks. So I think I might just provide just a bit of a summary to start with, because we have covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time. But some sort of personal reflections I make from the presentations that we've had today. So I think it's clear, and we've started off to really sort of have the scene sort of set around that there is a strong global need for policy and evidence-based decision making to make good housing decisions, to meet some of the worldwide housing gaps and worldwide housing data gaps that we discussed in some of the opening remarks. It's clear also that the challenges that poses in the housing space are multidimensional, and certainly the presentations on that were making the case for the importance really highlighted that. Whether it was the providing the basic right of housing in Maldives across and looking at issues such as poverty and inequality, planning around internal migration, economic growth and population growth pressures, skill shortages with building and housing, and the environmental impacts of housing construction, land reclamation and impacts of climate change. The various data sources that were used in the US in the comprehensive housing market analysis. So one of the aspects that I thought was very interesting was around both the use of comprehensive private data, comprehensive public sector data sources, and combining that with the more timely private sector. There was also some of the challenges that were sort of identified with subnational data sets as well, particularly when we're starting to think about sort of what we might term federating those to try to bring those up to a national level, and the requirements to potentially negotiate with many different subnational jurisdictions. We also heard around how the housing market dynamics are important for a central bank such as the Reserve Bank of Australia, including the responsiveness of housing market dynamics to monetary policy and its links to inflations, and how some of the data is used by the RBA to analyse some of these dynamics. And also, just now, we heard how housing data is sort of situated in the broader work of a national statistics office like Statistics Canada. Although I would say that I think that, as I was alluding to, I think that Jean-Philippe has kind of outlined quite a strong vision for how a conceptual framework can assist in developing and integrating data, and answering some of the questions that have been posed. So I think that the presentations and feedback that have been provided by everyone provide an excellent starting point for developing both the case for why integrated housing statistics are important, and how the statistical community can think about developing that integrated framework to answer some of these very important questions. And as was alluded to as well in the present and by Jean-Philippe, this is the first in a series of webinars. So the second webinar we will be looking to organise for this sprint in October after the Northern Summer. So we are still working to sort of have the timing to be confirmed for that. And so we'd ask you to keep an eye on the UN Statistics Division website as more information for that comes out. But it really will sort of focus more on the practical sort of implementation aspects of that once. So sort of taking some of these concepts of given what might be some of the ways that we can actually practically fill some of the data gaps that have been identified. The slides and a recording of the webinar will be available from the UN Statistics Division's website, which and a link for that should be available in the where you find the where you had the agenda, and it has popped up in the chat. So thank you for those people who put that in there. And also, for those of you who might be watching this on a recording and are in the far reaches of the globe, or possibly close to me, from a time perspective, we do understand that the time zone does not suit everyone, and we are working to have a follow-up event at a time which might be suitable for other parts of the world, particularly those of us close to me in Asia Pacific. So we'll have more information about that in the second webinar in October. So I'd like to close and again on behalf of the UN Network of Economic Statisticians, extend a thank you and to everyone for their attendance at today's webinar, and also wanted to thank our organisers and presenters, Mr. Stefan Schweinfest, who did the lion's share of the chairing, Mr. Michael Mlinar, who gave opening remarks, presenters, His Excellency Dr. Ali Haider Ahmed, Dr. Kurt Yuzowski, Mr. Jonathan Hamburg, and Mr. Jean-Philippe de Chanteleport. I also wanted to thank the organising task team who put this together again, from my colleagues in the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Statistics Canada, the Maldives Bureau of Statistics, UN Habitat, and the UN Statistics Division. So thank you, everyone, and I wish you all the best.